I'm going to give an introductory lecture right now about speculative realism and object-oriented ontology, which are two closely related philosophical groups, and I'm the only shared member of both, and so I guess I'm the right person to weigh in on both. And of course I have two different audiences here. I have some people in the audience who are completely saturated with this stuff already, both from reading books and from reading blogs, and I have other people who may not know anything about it or not much about it, and so I want to try to pitch this at a level that everyone can enjoy, covering familiar terrain maybe in a fresh way. Speculative realism and object-oriented ontology. Well, the easy way to explain their relation is that speculative realism is the larger term. It encompasses a greater range of philosophical positions. However, it's not as old. Object-oriented philosophy is an older term. It's one that I coined in 1999, and I was the only one for quite a while until first Levi jumped on board, and then we have Ian and Tim now as well. Whereas speculative realism is a term, as a group, it dates to 2006, and as a term to 2007. And I'll give you a little bit of the history here. Speculative realism was a group, originally the brainchild of Ray Brassier, who was then at Middlesex University in London and is now at the American University of Beirut. He had a somewhat vague idea of bringing together me, himself, and Ian Hamilton Grant of Bristol for an event, because he thought there was some similar interest there in speculative philosophy, a similar shared frustration with some of the dominant trends in continental philosophy. And then what happened in early 2006, something very remarkable. A book appeared in France called Après la finitude, After Finitude, by Kant and Meillassoux, who may be described, I guess, as the star pupil of Badiou. And Ray Brassier returned from Paris from vacation and told me there's this book I've got to read that's right up my alley. He hadn't had a chance to read it yet himself, but I immediately ordered it and read it and was transfixed by this fascinating book by Meillassoux. I wish he could be here with us today as well. But speculative realism has now become a looser term encompassing many more people. It's no longer a rigid designator for those four people who met at Goldsmiths College in 2007. It's more of a rallying cry that you find especially in the blogosphere, especially among the young. People under 30 are very drawn to this term. So I would say if there's one term or one concept that links together all the speculative realists, it's this critique of correlationism. Now, what is correlationism? Correlationism is a term coined by Meillassoux. He wanted to call his opponents idealists, but you really can't, because Husserl's not really just an idealist, right? Because Husserl can say the mind is always already outside itself, pointing at objects. Kantians can say Kant gives a refutation of idealism. Almost no one's going to come out and admit to being a full-blown idealist these days. But there's still a problem. The problem is that all of these dominant philosophies in continental thought today, humans are very much at the center. Object-object relations are really nowhere to be seen if they're not mediated by a human observer in some way. And so correlationism is the term that Meillassoux coined because what's at the center of all these philosophies is a correlate of human and world. What's always at the center of these philosophies is human and world together. You can't talk about the world by itself. You can't talk about a disembodied Cartesian subject by itself, but you have to talk about their mutual interplay. And this, in a way, is more dangerous than idealism because it thinks it's already beyond it. It thinks it's already more sophisticated than that. In continental philosophy, there's a tendency to view the realism-idealism dispute as a pseudo-problem. Husserl and Heidegger, two of my favorite philosophers, are both extremely guilty of this. They simply sneer at the question. I think it's safe to say, although realism has always been a palatable option in analytic philosophy in many quarters, I think it's safe to say it never was in continental philosophy until 2002. I think Delanda and I were the first two to openly say we're realists in the continental tradition, not to be playing around with ironic formulations, but just to say we're realists. Bruno Latour had called himself a realist in 1999 in Pandora's Hope, but there was irony there, and he was redefining what the term meant. He wasn't really a realist in that sense. So I think Delanda and I in 2002 were the first to make that a plausible option again. And then Meillassoux' book came out a couple of years later, 4 years later. All right, so correlationism is neither realism nor idealism. It tries to be beyond both. But it always places the human and world at the center. And the roots of this philosophy clearly lie in Kant, Immanuel Kant, where you can't talk about the relations between things and themselves. This will be dogmatic. So you have to retreat and take this critical stance towards everything first. And this is what philosophy becomes about. Philosophy becomes a meditation on the correlates. What are the categories of the understanding by which we can encounter the world? What are the linguistic structures through which the world is accessible, and so forth. Simply talking about the world has become very difficult in the past 200 years of continental thought. Now, and because of this, speculative realism has had a certain flavor of anti-Kantian critique of Kant, and sometimes this gets caricatured as saying the speculative realists all just say Kant is evil. That's actually Ayn Rand, that's not us. because we're not saying Kant is evil. The point is each of us preserves one key aspect of Kant, and it's different in each case. And I'm going to focus today on the object-oriented version with which I am associated, and Meillassoux' Speculative Materialism. And I do have a book about Meillassoux coming out in July. I just finished it a few weeks ago. It's called Meillassoux, Philosophy in the Making. And this will include an in-depth survey of all of his published works in English, both After Finitude and the articles in the journal Collapse, as well as 90 pages of translated excerpts from his long-withheld major work, L'Inexistence Divine, or The Divine in Existence, which is quite a remarkable and bold piece of work in which God might exist in the future but does not yet exist. You can read it for yourself when the book comes out. Now, the human world correlate does two separate things. One of them I endorse, one of them Meillassoux endorses. The first thing it does is it puts the human world relation at the center of things. Philosophy is about the relation between human and world. A great counterexample, someone who doesn't accept this at all, will be Whiteheads. And we're all here partly because we have a Whitehead conference at Claremont in a few days. And Whitehead is really maybe the boldest 20th century philosopher in simply disregarding the Kantian tradition, he along with Bergson, but especially Whitehead. That's one thing. It puts the human world relation at the center. And the other thing is it limits our knowledge. It's a theory of finitude. There's something out there that we can't quite know exhaustively. Now, I think it's safe to say that Meillassoux' position and object-oriented philosophy take the reverse positions on these two features. For Meillassoux, it's fine that the human-world relation is at the center. Meillassoux thinks correlationism is a strong argument. If I try to talk about a tree outside of thought, well, then I'm thinking it, and so it's not really outside of thought. Right? And so this is Meillassoux' starting point. Meillassoux thinks that's a powerful argument, and it takes lots of logical trickery to escape from that in his book. For me, that's a weak argument. I think that's... We'll talk about that a little more as this talk goes on, but I don't think it's very strong at all. What Meillassoux is bothered by in Kant is the finitude of human knowledge, the idea that we can't know the things in themselves. Meillassoux is a partisan of absolute knowledge. His real roots are in Hegel. He, like Badiou and Zizek, are not realists in the normal sense, in that there's something outside of the mind that we can't grasp. This is why they tend to call themselves materialists rather than realists, because they think there is something outside the mind, but it's knowable. It can be comprehended according to certain features that we can know about it. Whereas object-oriented philosophy takes the reverse position on these things. For me, finitude is inevitable because a thing cannot be translated into knowledge of the thing. It's not like a thing has a certain number of qualities, and by mapping those qualities in your mind, you can replicate the thing exactly in your mind. The thing is an act. The thing is a reality. Any knowledge we have of that is only going to be a translation. And so for me, the finitude is inevitable. This is Kant's greatest strength. Whereas for me, the human world correlate is the problem with Kant. And I picked this up from reading Whitehead late in my graduate school career carefully, that the human world relation is simply a special case of any relation at all. Any relation will distort its terms with respect to one another. It's not just this sad, poignant feature of human knowledge that I can't grasp all the aspects of the table. This is something the floor is guilty of as well. It might not be conscious of it the way humans are, but no object is going to perfectly translate another into its own terms. So, in a way, we simply, my position, OOO, and Meillassoux simply have two opposite takes on Kant. Okay, let's start with realism and then go on to the speculative parts. First of all, if we ask what is realism, there's a very wonderful book that came out a couple of years ago by a gentleman named Lee Braver called A Thing of This World. And this is a very important book. It's a gigantic book, Northwestern University Press, well worth a read, in which he surveys the entire history of continental philosophy and tries to show that it's all an anti-realist tradition. He starts with Kant, doesn't he? And he goes all the way to Derrida, who was kind of the crowning moment of anti-realism. And you wonder what's left after Derrida. There seems to be not much room. What's important about this book is that Braver came right out and mapped continental philosophy in terms of the realism-anti-realism dispute at all, which is usually considered this pseudo-problem that has nothing to do with the deeper philosophical considerations. And the other important thing about Braver's book is that he is aware of the ambiguity of what the term realism means. He says there are at least 6 different features, which he calls R1 through R6, and then he pairs them with their antimatter complements, A1 through A6, the anti-realist versions. So for example, R1, which is the most important, the world exists independently of the mind, whereas A1 will be the world does not exist independently of the mind. And what he does so subtly is he goes through and shows that some of these thinkers can be realists on some points and anti-realists on others. So he's able to say that, I don't remember, Nietzsche is an A1, but R3, R4, A5. And it's actually very helpful. You have that glossary in the front that tells you what each of the positions is. Now, one of my complaints about that book, which I reviewed for Philosophy Today, and I like it very much, in case Lee is watching, I'll remind him that I really love his book. The one thing I was not so happy with is that he missed, to me, one of the key features of realism, which I call R7, which does not appear in his book, which is that all relations have to be on the same footing. that you can't privilege the human-world relation as the root of all the others, as happens in Kant's philosophy. Whereas A7 would be that the human-world correlate is primary. So I think this is the key point he missed on his list. Also, I think some of his realist points are not essential to realism. For example, the correspondence theory of truth is on his list. Maybe it was R6, or I don't remember, that the mind can adequately map the worlds. I don't think that's really necessary to be a realist. You can make the case that Heidegger's a realist, but he's certainly not a believer in the correspondence theory of truth. There is, being is there outside of us, perhaps, but you can't adequately mirror it in your mind. You can unveil it gradually. So I would say that, but Braver knows this. Braver knows that not every realism has to have all the realist features. Okay. Now, you could say that Meillassoux and I agree about R1. We both agree that there's a mind-independent reality, but I think his sense of it is too weak. Because as a partisan of absolute knowledge, he thinks you can actually know, you can exhaustively grasp the essence of the table. And I think this is a problem. I think this puts human knowledge too much in the driver's seat in reality. And I'll get to this in a moment here. So that's the realism part. The speculative part is maybe the surprising adjective when added to realism, because realism is usually seen as a boring, dull, middle-aged philosophy that's there to draw limits to wild speculation and stop this pie-in-the-sky idealism and get down to the facts. It's a kind of inhibited philosophy. As I said in one of my publications, I don't remember which one, that realism is the philosophy as health inspectors are to restaurants. It's viewed that they're simply there to stop people from going too far, making any messes, and hence the importance of this adjective, speculative. You've all heard of men are from Mars, women are from Venus. I would say that realism's from Saturn, speculation's from Jupiter, to continue the astrological metaphor. Because what is Saturn traditionally? It's the planet of inhibition, of challenge, of forcing you to get down to the reality and face your limitations. Whereas Jupiter is always the planet of speculation, of expansiveness, of rolling the dice and winning. And so putting these two together is a very powerful combination. That you could have a realism that is a weird realism, as we call it sometimes. A realism that is not just a commonsensical theory of billiard balls outside the mind that really do hit each other and move each other, but a kind of theory that gives a strange version of reality that realists normally are not associated with. And you could read Meillassoux' books or mine, and you'll quickly see what that entails. For example, in Meillassoux' philosophy, you already have an after finitude radical contingency in which anything can happen at any moment for no reason whatsoever. That's not your typical sort of realism. In his still unpublished major work, L'Inexistence Divine, you have a God that can appear or not appear suddenly at any moment for any reason whatever and inaugurate a reign of perfect justice that will also resurrect the dead and compensate them for their sufferings. He thinks this is the only object worthy of ethical thought. So this is, again, a fairly wild-sounding theory that does not sound within the realm of probability, which he deals with by denying the importance of probability. Things cannot be measured in terms of likely or unlikely at that level. And then in my theory, you have objects that cannot touch directly. They're withdrawn from one another. They can interact only indirectly. So these are not your typical sorts of common-sense realisms. Okay, so not only is there a world outside the mind, but the world outside the mind is weird, and it has very little to do with common sense. Let me talk a little about Meillassoux' version in a little more detail for some of you who haven't read the book, and then I'll go into my alternative after saying what I think is unsuccessful about his theory, although I'm a great admirer of it. I'm not a devotee of his theory at all. We're at odds over many points. Meillassoux' book After Finitude begins with the problem of ancestrality, which is sometimes misunderstood. The correlationist says, if I speak about the world, I'm only speaking about the world for me, right? Because I can't escape this loop. If I try to talk about the Big Bang, well, it's only the Big Bang for me, because I cannot get outside this circle of thought and talk about something without talking about it or without thinking about it. And so I'm kind of stuck in this self-reflexive loop. And what Meillassoux does at the beginning of the book is he points out this is an aporia for science, because what does science claim to do? Science claims to make literal statements about things that happened before any consciousness emerged. Now, this is not a proof. Meillassoux just does this to call our attention to a problem, that there's a discrepancy between what science claims to do and what the correlationists claim is the foundation of human knowledge, which is that we cannot escape from this loop. And I'm going to show you a chart here, because some people misunderstand, I think, the beginning of that book and think that Meillassoux is just a straightforward realist. He's not. Meillassoux is a great admirer of correlationist philosophy, and in my opinion, he never fully escapes it. I think this is the problem with his theories. In my book, I described 4 positions that I call Meillassoux' spectrum. He doesn't give it this name. And there's actually more like 6 or 7 in his presentation. I've oversimplified a little bit, but these are the 4 main ones. Here you have naive realism, which he totally abhors. He completely supports Kant's attack on this, on naive or dogmatic realism. This is the idea that there is a world independent of the mind and we can adequately know it. Okay, this is pre-Kantian dogmatism. Then you have the position he calls weak correlationism, which is essentially Kant's. That you can think the things themselves but not know them. There has to be something out there, but we can't know them, but we can at least think that they're there. This is not good enough for Meillassoux because it doesn't take the correlationist objection seriously enough. It doesn't realize that we can't talk about the things in themselves without talking about them and therefore bringing them back into the circle of thought. So this is essentially the German idealist objection to Kant that Meillassoux supports. And let's go all the way to absolute idealism now for a second. And this will be the idea that you absolutely cannot speak about anything outside the mind because you're always going to be stuck in that reflexive loop. Now, what Meillassoux tries to do, and I don't think it works, is he tries to insert this intermediate position that he calls strong correlations, which is, there's several ways he formulates it, but the relevant one here is, I can't think of anything outside the mind, and yet there still might be something outside the mind. Whereas the absolute idealist says, and therefore there can't be, since I'm stuck in this loop of thoughts. If I try to talk about the tree outside of thought, it's something I'm thinking, and therefore it becomes recuperated by the circle of correlation. Meillassoux says, yes, but all that proves is that we can't think anything outside of it. There still might be something outside of it. And so he tries to insert this new position here. And this is important because Meillassoux' own philosophy is a radicalization of this, just as I would say my own philosophy is a radicalization at this point. Why? Because in a way, I'm preserving Kant's point that there are things in themselves that we can think them and not know them, and simply extending it to all entities, so that it's not simply humans. It's not this poignant theory of human finitude, but it's something that haunts all relations at all, because a thing cannot be replicated in its appearance to another. A table does things like support the computer, like sit on the floor. My knowledge of the table does not do any of those things. Right? So the table is not just a set of qualities that can be replicated in my mind that exhaustively model the table. More about that in a minute. But Meillassoux' attempt is to radicalize this position, strong correlations. What Meillassoux does, which is actually very brilliant, is say strong correlationism is different from absolute idealism because there might be something outside. We know there might be something outside. And he says that's an absolute possibility. It is absolutely true that there might be something outside. If it weren't, then we would just be absolute idealists. And then he transforms that absolute possibility into the absolute contingency of everything, or he tries to, so that you can't say that anything has any reason whatsoever. There is the principle of sufficient reason collapses for Meillassoux. Now, in my opinion, this position is impossible because it's meaningless to say that there might be something outside of us if everything becomes recuperated by the correlationist loop. So in other words, if I say I can't think the table outside thought, but there might be something outside of thought, that's a meaningless statement from Meillassoux' position, because to speak of something outside thought is already a thought in his position, right? And so I don't think he can get enough traction to escape that at all. I think he is driven to absolute idealism. I think his position, his attempt at an original position cannot work. Okay. From proving the absolute contingency of all things, as he thinks he proves, he thinks he's able to prove the law of non-contradiction and the existence of things in themselves through a very bold set of arguments. What he says is if there were a contradictory thing, it cannot be contingent, because a contradictory thing has no opposite and cannot pass in anything else, and therefore it must exist. As for things in themselves, he says there must be things in themselves because there can't be contingency unless there are things that are contingent, since he's already proven the existence of contingency, he thinks. So he ends up with the belief that there are non-contradictory things in themselves, but that they have absolutely no reason whatsoever for being as they are. And on this basis, he dismisses the laws of probability when you're talking about the level of natural laws. Why? Because he says we can measure probability for intraworldly things. We can measure the probability that this marker will roll one direction or another if I push it a certain way. But he says, as far as laws themselves, we cannot know through the mere repetition of laws that they are inevitable, that they're necessary, because we have no idea how many possible universes there are. They can't be totalized. He uses Cantor's transfinite mathematics, like Badiou does, to try to show that at the level of worlds, you can never show what the probability of improbability of certain laws of nature existing or not existing are. And therefore, probability is irrelevant at that level, and therefore he builds his entire philosophy of history out of incredibly implausible events, incredibly implausible jumps. He says there's been several. First there was matter, then there was life, and life coming out of matter was not for a reason. It wasn't because there was a particular configuration of cells that are able to live. There's simply a radical jump for no reason, for the appearance of life. And from life to thought, the same thing. Life jumps to thought for no reason at all. And once you're at thought, what's left to do? He thinks that human thought is the highest thing there is. The only thing radical enough to match those jumps is justice. And this is what's going to require the virtual God to come and create a reign of justice and resurrect all the dead who suffered and were killed so wrongly. And it sounds completely improbable. It sounds like science fiction when you read it, but when you think about it, he attempts to pave the way for this by assaulting the notion of probability, of likelihood and unlikelihood. And so you end up with this theory which, instead of measuring the probable steps in history, he measures the radical contours of history, and that's how we judge history. We judge it by what are the most radical possible jumps that it could occur, and the fourth one is the last one. And then he has to add all these other things at the end of the book, like wouldn't we be dissatisfied if that world of justice came? What will we have left to live for if everything were perfect? There'd be a kind of despair we'd be left with. And also, the other question he has to answer politically is, why should we work for this world of justice if it's going to happen for no reason at all? If it's just going to jump out of nowhere without our causing it, what's the point of going and holding marches and lobbying for the rights of workers and things? He says it's because the world of justice will have no meaning unless we hope for it in advance. It has to be something humans hope for, so it's as if we caused it. Even though we know it's not something we caused, it's as if. He's also got a more detailed philosophy of history in that book, in which he talks about how history has been dominated by a series of symbols of what the ideal is. I mean, the ancient world was cosmological, right? That the heavens were a perfect realm beneath which the earth paled, and that collapsed, of course, thanks to Galileo and Newton, was replaced by the romantic symbol, which is the idea that sentimentality, suffering should be avoided. Every living creature naturally has pity for every other. That collapsed because, for the reason that it seems obviously false. And what we are left with then is what he calls the historical symbol, which is the belief that there's an invisible hand guiding the course of events, in this case the economy. It's a very interesting reading he gives. That we just both the Marxists and capitalists will say that all the random individual actions lead naturally towards the good end, either the destruction of capitalism or the amassing of wealth. And so we have this kind of naive idea, just as the ancients had in the perfection of the cosmos, we have this naive idea about the perfection of the economy. And the economy and history are taking us in the right direction automatically and impersonally. And he wants to replace that with his own symbol, which is the hope for justice, the absolute hope for redemption for all people who have died unjustly. So that gives you a brief overview of the two books, as much as I could have done in 7 or 8 minutes. And I just want to say briefly what I think the problems are with his philosophy. There are at least 5. The first of them is, I don't think the correlational circle is a very strong objection. His entire philosophical standpoint is based on the idea that it's this devastating problem that how can I think something outside thought without turning into a thought? And it's occurred to me in the last couple of years that this is really the same as Meno's paradox in Plato's Meno, that you can't know something if you don't know it, and you can't search for something if you already know it. You either know something or you don't. Of course, Socrates' response to this is, it's a love of wisdom. You can know something without knowing it. You can. Our entire discipline is based on this idea that you can know something without knowing it. And I think Meillassoux' approach denies that. You end up with, his philosophy ends up being a wisdom about thoughts rather than a love of wisdom about the reality. I've already said that I think strong correlationism is impossible. In my book, I compare it to certain Zen maxims. It's like the sound of one hand clapping or the gateless gate, to think that I can't think anything outside of thought, but there might be something outside of thought. Well, what does that mean? That's a meaningless statement when judged from within Meillassoux' own position. I don't think it's possible. And in Prince of Networks, I didn't spell this out, but that was at the basis of my claim there that in the latter part of the book that this is what he really is. He really is an absolute idealist, just as I think Badiou and Zizek are as well. And that's really the current in which he's working. Here's another problem. There is no theory of part and whole in Meillassoux, and let me explain what I mean by that. He talks about the contingency of events linked to each other across time. He's talking about efficient causation across time. So there's no reason that I can't grow wings in the next second and fly away. This could happen for any reason. What he doesn't talk about are causal relations within an instance, right? Which are part-whole relations. Can be looked at as part-whole relations. Mereology. Could I be made of gold atoms or of armies of little horses rather than what I'm made of now? This is not an issue he tackles. I suppose he would say yes because he thinks everything's contingent, but it's not something he cares about. Time is what he cares about. He even says problems of space are not that interesting. And this was in response to my review in Philosophy Today, I believe. He added a couple pages in the English version of After Finitude that weren't in the French, and I'm pretty sure they're in response to my review, where I said, why is the Big Bang more problematic than an object in a refrigerator in an abandoned house that we're not seeing? And he's actually, I think, too dismissive of that objection in his supplement to the English book. He says that's not so interesting because even if I'm not looking at the object in the refrigerator right now, I could in principle go and look at the object in the refrigerator, whereas I could not in principle go see the Big Bang because there was no consciousness. I don't think this argument works. I could in principle go see the Big Bang if certain conditions were met. And I think this happens because his theory of the thing in itself simply isn't deep enough. Meillassoux thinks he proves the existence of things in themselves. But if you look at what they are, all the things in themselves really means for Meillassoux is that if we all die, they're still going to be there. All these objects in the room will still be here if we die. That's only part of the thing in itself for Kant. The other part is how does the thing in itself differ when we're not dead and we're here looking at it? How does it differ from what we see? For Meillassoux, not at all. For Meillassoux, knowledge can absolutely exhaust the thing. He does not believe in the finitude of knowledge whatsoever. And I think that's not a strong enough sense of the thing in itself, things in themselves, as I'll explain in a minute when I talk about Heidegger. And finally, there's an ambiguity about law in his system. Meillassoux says the laws of nature are absolutely contingent and can change at any moment for any reason, for no reason at all. There is no reason for anything. But then he accepts the existence of laws. This is the strange thing. He does believe there's a thing called laws, just that they can change at any time. So there are certain banal things that happen in nature according to law. It's only now and then that we have this radical change of the laws of nature for no reason whatsoever. It might not be frequent. It might be only once in a while. Why does he have any concept of laws at all? If he's really concerned about the absolute contingency of everything, there should be no law-bound interconnections between things at all. They should happen in complete independence. I think here he's simply stuck in this Badiouian rut of thinking there has to be a distinction between the state of the situation and truth events. Right? That there has to be one realm that's kind of boring and unfolding predictably, and then once in a while there's this amazing transformation. And I don't think that's radical enough. I think he should have said that there's an absolute contingency, like the occasionalists do, from Islamic philosophy on and through modern French philosophy. Nothing's connected through anything else. They say God connects everything. I'm not saying you should say God connects everything, but I think you should raise the problem of what connects everything. You can't just assume that there are laws most of the time. So, to repeat, Meillassoux wants to dump finitude from Kant, but he wants to preserve the human world's priority, and I want to do the opposite. I think the finitude is inevitable, absolute knowledge is impossible, yet we need to expand this so that it's not just a epistemological matter of human knowledge, it infests the very nature of causal relations, so that when fire burns cotton, fire does not exhaust the cotton any more than my knowledge of the cotton exhausts it, to use another Islamic example. So I would recommend the opposite of what Meillassoux does. Meillassoux radicalizes strong correlationism, which I say is impossible because I say strong correlationism does not exist. I think it's a mission impossible for Meillassoux. Whereas I'm saying we should radicalize this, which is very possible. Weak correlationism is possible. We just radicalize Kant by coupling that tradition with Whitehead's tradition, or even Leibniz's in some way, which is that all the relations are on equal footing. Every relation distorts the relatum in the same fashion as human consciousness does. Human consciousness is more sophisticated, more interesting perhaps, but not ontologically different. What humans do should not be made part of a basic ontological fissure in the cosmos. It's just, we're simply one very complicated and interesting entity among others. Okay, so how are we doing? I got more time. I want to go on to the object-oriented position now that I've critiqued Meillassoux. This position for me goes back to the 1990s. It started for me back when I was working on my master's degree work at Penn State with Lingus. I was writing on Heidegger and Levinas, and the first thing I noted is that the tool analysis isn't just the tool analysis. It's not just about hammers and drills. It applies to any entities, and so you can universalize it. And if you push it far enough, in a way, all of Heidegger's ideas boil down to that tool analysis, because all of Heidegger's about this veiling and unveiling and being upsurging from the depths, and that's really all there in the tool analysis, despite what some people say. But I read it differently from how most people read it. The way most people read it, it's often read as a kind of pragmatism, right? There's a primacy of practical reason. Deeper than theory is the fact that we are practically using the floor, and we're using the podium, we're using language. That's the kind of unthematized background from which all of our consciousness emerges. There's a problem with this, though, which is that the things also withdraw from practice. Using a hammer does not exhaust the hammer any more than looking at the hammer and talking about it does. Heideggerians still usually do not see this point. They still want to, usually, not all of them, but some of them, most of them want to say that theoretical distortion of the hammer or the S structure is somehow more special than any other kind, but praxis does this as well. And so pragmatism can't work. And that's the second step. The third step is to say that entities do this to each other as well. And this is the contribution of Whitehead's position, that it's not just there's something magical about the human brain that is unable to capture the reality of things. A causal relation also is not a total relation, right? A causal relation, when fire burns the cotton, fire burns something flammable about the cotton. It doesn't burn the color or the odor, which are of no interest to the fire whatsoever. So it's not. We shouldn't distinguish between humans and inanimate objects on that level on the basis of the fact that we supposedly have consciousness and they don't. What is more primary is the fact that you have a difference between reality and relation. Any relation is going to translate the reality into something different from what it was. That is really the basis of OOO. Another author who really helped me here was Zubiri, the Spanish philosopher who is not widely read. He wrote this big technical book called On Essence in the 1960s. It was translated to English in 1980. You can still get it in used copies on Amazon and places like this. And you need a couple months to get through it, but I would recommend this. The tone of the book is kind of a dull, sort of Thomist, scholastic philosophy, but the ideas are really strange. And it's, in fact, the first time I read the book, I said he cannot possibly be right about this, but I think he is now. And that idea is that the essence of a thing, things do have an essence for him, which is deeper than any of their relations with other things. So you can never define a thing in relational terms. And this got me thinking against Heidegger's tool analysis, that a hammer is not its relational significance for the other entities in the world. A hammer is something deeper than all those things. It's whatever supports all those possible relations, because you can keep adding on new relations to the hammer every second, put the hammer into new contexts, it's still the same hammer. But it's a totally non-relational hammer. It withdraws from all reality. It is completely unexpressed in the world sometimes, and it's anyway not identifiable with all of its relations to other things. So this is the weird kind of realism that we have. Not a realism of measurable physical quantities of matter, because what do you do when you get that? You're measuring the weights and the shape of matter. The matter has to be something deeper than those things. I mean, not the matter, the object itself has to be something deeper than those things. And the problem is Zubiri doesn't go far enough. Zubiri is still a little too traditionalistic in that he thinks that only certain things have an essence. So, for example, a farm does not have an essence, he says, right? Because a farm only has a relational reality. Somebody has to farm it, so there have to be animals on it, so there have to be trucks come and take the things. I say, who cares? Because a farm is still something deeper than its specific relations to anything right now. A farm might have certain people visiting it today, new people visiting tomorrow, maybe changes its crops next season. It's still the same farm. So I don't see that the fact that the farm is in relation to things matters. The farm is something deeper than those relations. And what Zubiri ends up with is the essence of the thing is what he calls the atomic cortical structure, which sounds disappointingly vague and materialistic. And it reminds me of Kripke. Kripke has this wonderful, naming a necessity. You've got the rigid designator pointing at the thing behind any of its qualities. But then what do you end up with is the real essence of things for Kripke. It's how many protons gold has. It's a purely physical material definition. It's not good enough. All right. So I say objects withdraw from each other too. And to claim otherwise, to claim, even as Meillassoux does against me, that this is anthropomorphizing things, this is what I call the taxonomic fallacy. I call that for the first time in the Quadruple logic. The taxonomic fallacy is when you take a basic ontological rift and try to assign it to specific entities embodying that rift. So if you say, for example, there's a difference between absolute knowledge and contextual knowledge, and natural sciences represent the absolute knowledge, and the humanities represent the contextual knowledge, that's an example of the taxonomic fallacy. For example, I saw that the journal Collapse defined speculative realism in this way on its website recently, saying that speculative realism is a philosophy that defends science against the humanities, something like that. No, it's not. Speculative realism is a philosophy that defends reality against relation. That doesn't mean that the natural sciences necessarily do it better than the humanities do. That's their own axe to grind, because they have a kind of scientistic bias at that journal, which is very different from what object-oriented ontology believes. They're comrades in arms on one limited front, but in another they're saying exactly the opposite of the truth, in my opinion. And another example of the taxonomic fallacy is here. If you say that there's reality and then relation, and humans are the ones responsible for relation, because humans are the only ones who are conscious enough to rise above something and think of it as what it is, and thereby distort its reality and have to try to recover that reality through absolute knowledge. No, cotton and fire do this every bit as much as humans do. Humans are, again, different. I'm not saying that cotton balls are, have dreams and emotions and things like this. I'm just saying that there's a more primitive level at which they do resemble us. We're both entities. We both relate to things and distort them through our relations. So, for this reason, I say that absolute knowledge of the kind that Meillassoux wants is impossible, because you cannot take a reality and mirror it in a mind. What is in your mind will not be doing the same work as the real thing. Knowledge of a tree is not the same as the tree. And the objection I always get is, well, that's stupid, that's a straw man. Nobody's claiming that the knowledge of the tree is really a tree. Well, I'm not saying they're claiming it, I'm saying their position entails it. Right? That they can't help stumbling into that. If you think, like Meillassoux does, that having 100% of the qualities of the tree in your mind is just as good as the real tree, and then when you die, those qualities will still be there, and those qualities together form the tree. No, why is the knowledge of the tree in your mind not taking roots and growing fruits and having leaves fall from it? You have to come up with some theory of what the difference is, because he's not going to say that. He's not going to say that the idea of the tree in your mind is growing fruit, of course. What's the difference? They're going to end up with some lame theory of matter, right? These ideas stamped in matter. And then you're back to the most boring traditional kind of Platonic theory where it's a form stamped in matter. I don't think they want to say that, but that's where they're driven. The only way to get around that is to say that the realities are performance, they're an execution, they're an action, and that is only translated into the forms of knowledge that we have of it. And that is why, in my theory, an idea that is absolutely compelling to me but not universally popular is the idea of vicarious causation. Because if one thing always distorts another, if one thing never makes full contact with another, how can it make any contact with it at all? How can a thing, when I hit this podium, how can I make any contact with the podium at all? Given the real podium supposedly withdraws from my real hand, according to the elements of my theory as laid out already. So there has to be an indirect kind of causation. There has to be some way of explaining how one thing indirectly maneuvers into position to affect another, or to perceive another, or to touch another. And again, this is what led me back to the very venerable occasionalist tradition, which is usually ridiculed, because it's usually viewed just as a naive theology where God is coming down and intervening every second in everything that happens, so that I drop the note cards, God is actually pulling the note cards down, it's not gravity. And this is something undergraduates like making fun of when they hear about Malebranche, fine. But there's some seriousness to this tradition, which is that it goes all the way back to Islamic theology in Iraq, the Ash'arites, who simply had a very radical reading of one passage in the Quran. There's a passage in the Quran that refers to you think you threw the stones, but in fact it was Allah who threw the stones, and they simply interpreted that universally to mean all actions are done by God. It's obviously blasphemous in monotheism to claim that anyone has creative power other than God's. They were claiming that you also can't say anyone but God has causal power, and so therefore God is intervening. Things exist only for an instant, because endurance is an accident that has to be given to things by God. They're vanishing every instant. This did not immediately penetrate into European philosophy, of course. It took about 700 or 800 years. You can't really find a medieval occasionalist. I've looked around for some, and as far as I can tell, there aren't. There's Nicolas d'Autricourt, who's sort of seen as the medieval Hume, but there's not really a medieval occasionalist. You find Thomas Aquinas attacking the occasionalists, but not by name. Suarez quotes Aquinas' attack and says that Aquinas doesn't name any names, but he's talking about this occasionalism, and Suarez says it's impossible. He gives reasons why he thinks this is impossible. And of course, it comes back into French philosophy through Descartes' problem of mind relating to body. How can mind and body relate since they're so different? God must be linking them. And then after Descartes, it comes back into object-object relations as well. It's not just mind and body, but it's body and body also have this need for occasional causation. And in a way, this might sound kind of quaint and antiquated, but it's not. Because what do we do in modern philosophy? The occasionalists give God a monopoly on all causal relations. More recent philosophy simply gives the human mind a monopoly on causal relations, right? In Hume or Kant, it's habit. Habit's the only thing that really we know gives causal relations between things. For Kant, it's the categories. And so the humans simply replace gods. The autonomous causal relations between things that are not human and not God disappear from philosophy. We need to bring them back. This is my thesis. How do we get this? We have to get what I have somewhat jokingly called a secular occasionalism, where we're trying to talk about indirect relations between things that are not through God, and not only through the human mind, but directly with each other, but through a mediator. And this was one of the main themes of my book on Latour, Prince of Networks, which is that Latour is really the first secular occasionalist in many ways. Because Latour, despite being a very pious Catholic in his personal life, is not someone who brings God into his philosophy, of course, to do work very often. He's a very secular theorist in that way. And what Latour says is any relation between any two things needs a mediator, and his classic example is the one about Joliot, the French physicist, who was the first person, at least in France, to link politics with neutrons. Who would have thought that politics had anything to do with neutrons? It takes the atomic bomb project to do that, to show that there might be a political use for these neutrons. And so Latour puts Joliot in as the mediator between those two. There's a problem here for Latour, though, which is that Latour is a completely flat ontology where everything's equal. And so if politics and neutrons only touch through Joliot, how can Joliot touch politics and how can Joliot touch neutrons? Doesn't there have to be a mediator there between those? His answer to that has always been unsatisfactory to me. His answer has kind of always been a pragmatic one. That, well, you can take the analysis as far as you want, as long as it's interesting. And politics and neutrons, that's an interesting link, but Joliot and neutrons isn't that interesting unless you want to talk about the apparatus that he's using. I don't think that works. I think you have to explain metaphysically how it's possible for any contact to happen at all. And in my theory, this is possible, unlike Latour's, because my ontology is not completely flat, as I will review again this afternoon on my last talk. For Latour, everything is real as long as it has an effect on something else, at least in the early Latour. There's no deep reality distinct from an illusory reality. Popeye is just as real as a neutron, because both of them have effects on something else. For me, that's not the way it works, because for me there is a distinction between the real realm and what I call the sensual realm, which is basically the intentional realm of phenomenology. I don't call it intentional for two reasons. One is it's kind of a boring, sterile technical term, and sensual is a more interesting term. But then the French translator told me that wasn't a good enough reason and I needed to add another paragraph, so I did, and he translated it. And the second reason I came up with was that people get confused about what intentional means, right? Intentional sometimes is used to mean immanent, and sometimes it's used to mean the object you're pointing at outside the immanence. I was reading Barry Smith's book on Austrian philosophy. He criticizes even Dummett for making this mistake. Dummett, in his first edition of the book, said that for Brentano, the intentional object is something outside of the mind you're pointing at, and somebody must have told him that was wrong because it was erased from the second edition. And people get very confused about this. There should be no doubt that for both Brentano and Husserl, the intentional object is immanent. It's called immanent objectivity. It's an object that exists in the mind. It's distinct from anything that might exist outside the mind, which I don't think ever really is there in Husserl. There's never real objects in Husserl in my reading. So you've got the real realm, which is these withdrawn objects that cannot be translated, and then you've got the sensual realm, which are the things we can encounter, the things we're seeing in the room right now, the things we are in contact with, and not just us, but also inanimate objects when they relate with each other. The cotton ball is encountered by the fire is also a sensual cotton. The real cotton cannot be present for the fire any more than it can be for us. But both the real realm and the sensual realm are also split apart between their objects and their qualities. This is not something that all the OO people accept. I think, for example, Levi doesn't follow this model. This is my version, where, for example, if you look at Husserl, what is Husserl's great discovery? Some people say Husserl's not that interesting. He's just repeating Kant, or just, that sort of thing. What's really interesting about Husserl, I think, is the fact that he talks about a tension between intentional objects and intentional qualities, which you don't even really find very strongly in Brentano. Brentano's very indebted to the British empiricist tradition where things are bundled together from qualities. In Husserl, you have this real tension, because I can walk around a building and see different sides of it at different times. The building is not added up out of all those profiles at every second. It's not added up out of all the possible profiles of the thing, right? The building is a unit over and above those qualities. Moreover, that unit is given from the start. I look at it and I see, there's a building. I don't see, there's a profile, and I need to look at other profiles to figure out what this is. No, you look through the profile, you see the building. There's an intentional object there that's a unity that endures through these fluctuations of the sensual realm where you're walking around a thing, seeing it in different moods, different distances, different angles. So there's that tension there in the sensual realm. The same tension was already known in the real realm, because you've got, for example, in Leibniz, this idea that monads are units, but as units, they must have a plurality of qualities. If everything was just a unit, all things would be the same. And so there must be a unity and a diversity combined. And so you see, even in the real realm, there is this tension between unified objects and their plurality of qualities. So you've got four poles. You've got the real realm, which is hidden from us, which has unified objects and their many qualities. You've got the sensual realm, which Husserl showed very well, has the same tension. So you've got a fourfold. I have tried to argue in several publications that this is really what Heidegger was getting at with his fourfold. It takes a lot of painstaking reconstruction because he's very vague about what this means. I think you have to go back to the early Heidegger, back to 1919, when he's 29, 30 years old, where he gives his own fourfold theory there, not in terms of earth, sky, gods, and mortals, like in the Poetic later works, but in terms of Husserl's philosophy, where he says this is what it is. You've got the object as something specific, and it's something at all. And you've got the object hidden from us that's something specific, something at all. So there too, you've got this idea that the object is unified, but it also has a diversity of qualities, and that duality exists at two levels. It exists for us, or for observers of any kind, and exists in itself. So, if you read The Quadruple Object, which was published in French 2 weeks ago and will be out in English in the spring. You will also see some very nice diagrams in this book. For the first time in any of my book, well, first time I've had a lot of diagrams. I've had 10 in this book. Let me put up that. Diagram here. You have here the real objects, the real qualities, the essential objects, the essential qualities, and these stick lines are the most dominant relations. I call them tensions in the book. And what I try to show here, first of all, is that time and space belong to this schema, because here you have the tension that I would call time. You've got central objects and essential qualities. What is the experience of time? The experience of time is you feel something enduring, but you also feel its changes. You see something. You see kind of swirling patina of qualities atop things that change, even while the thing itself remains somewhat durable, at least for us, from moment to moment. And this is what we call time. At least the human experience of time. And then there's this. You've got a real object, a real hammer or something that's withdrawn from every axis to it, and yet there are qualities of it that are somehow emitted for us to directly contact. And this is what I call space, this diagonal line. Why? Because what is space about? The classical debate was between Leibniz and Clarke, where for Clarke, like Newton, time and space are absolute empty containers, whereas for Leibniz, time and space are relational. I'm a little closer to Leibniz on this, but I don't think he gets it right either. Time and space are not relational, but the site of relation and non-relation. Because what is spatial distance? Spatial distance means something is distant and near. I can go to Osaka. I'm not there now. But I can think about it. It's not in a completely disconnected universe. It's here, it's something I can get to, it's something I can think about now, and yet I'm not there. That is space. The difference between the real things that are not where I am and the qualities they reach out to us like tentacles, things of welcome, tentacles of welcome, asking us to approach them. So now only 2 of those 4 are covered. And this brings me to a philosophical problem I was wondering about ever since childhood, which is, why do we always talk about time and space as though those are the only 2 regions of that magnitude that deserve to be always spoken about together? Why is it always time and space? Couldn't we find some deeper model that incorporates those 2 and also leaves room for others? And yes, this is what we call the essence of a thing traditionally. The essence of a thing is the tension between its unity and its plurality of qualities. And then we've got one last line, and I struggled to find a name for this for a couple of years, and then I realized this is the Husserlian eidos, because what is the eidos in Husserl? It's, you have an object before the mind, say a candle, and through eidetic reduction you're trying to find out what are the essential features of that candle that it must have in order to be what it is. You get those only through categorical intuition. You're never going to be able to essentially make present for Husserl what it is that makes that candle essential. And so those are real qualities that you can only allude to, you can only hint at. And so there are the 4 basic parts of the charts, identified with 4 of the key terms in the history of philosophy. And there's all these other things that are less important. There ends up being 10 relations, because these things can relate to each other, these things can relate to each other, and each thing can relate to itself. But those aren't as important, so I'll leave those until you read the book. There end up being 10 kinds of relations. So there's this chart you can play with, and there are all kinds of theories you can come up with by looking at this grid. And if you don't like this version, my friends have other versions of OOO, so there's plenty to choose from. You can go shopping in the OOO supermarket. But, just to summarize, the spirit of this project is object-oriented philosophy is bringing back objects, not bringing back materialism. It's in many ways an anti-materialist project. I would agree with what Latour says in one of his recent publications, that materialism is always an idealism. Materialism thinks we can replace the thing itself by a certain limited range of palpable qualities of that thing that identify it, and that doesn't work. That's not realism. That is idealism, plain and simple. And so the realism we are arguing for is one of substantial forms, a famous old medieval term, resurrected by Leibniz. And this means returning to Aristotle, who is probably the most unpopular great philosopher right now. Everybody's ripping on Aristotle in every possible way. Aristotle is great. He's also a lot weirder than people think. Go back and read Aristotle, you're going to find strange jokes. You're going to find his theories are a lot stranger than you think. And so I would say to contemporary continental philosophy, we need less German idealism, less Bergson, more Aristotle, but a weird Aristotle, which I would describe as an Aristotle from Jupiter rather than from Saturn. Aristotle is not the Saturn philosopher as people think. Thank you very much.